And now for our presentation. 4 noteworthy figures from Unitarian or Universalist or Unitarian Universalist history. The first figure we are hearing about is Reverend John Murray. Joe Wolfarth is our presenter.
I'm curious. Raise your hand if you've heard of John Murray before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Okay, I didn't know who he was, so this was enlightening. Universalist John Murray, 1741. John Murray is born December 10th, a Sagittarian. Birthplace, Alton, a market town in East Hampshire, a district in the south of England. It's a town only 30 or 40 miles from the English Channel. His parents were both strict Calvinists. When he was 9, the family settled near Cork, Ireland. In 1760, the year he turned 19, Murray returned to England. There he joined the congregation of George Whitefield, an Anglican priest, an evangelical preacher who was one of the founders of Methodism. Murray had in fact heard Whitefield preach while in Ireland. George Whitefield is a historic figure of some renown. Whitefield was himself the child of innkeepers who would turn his passion for acting and theatrics into a knack for reenacting biblical scenes during his sermons. He worked his way through college, literally, as a servitor, a poor student at Oxford University who earned his keep by performing the duties of a servant for wealthier students. Whitefield would say that he despaired of earning God's grace through good works. He credited studying theology, specifically a book titled The Life of God and the Soul of Man by Henry Scougal, a Scot, a book that inspired many leaders of the Great Awakening or Evangelical Revival, from which we get the expression born again. Devotion to Jesus and repentance were central to this conversion. So Scougal inspired Whitefield to be born again, and Whitefield, who felt himself invested in serving God with, quote, a new heart and a new nature within, a supernatural gift from the Holy Spirit, would then inspire John Murray. Whitefield, as it happens, would inspire many, many others as well. It's worth noting that George Whitefield traveled to Savannah, Georgia in 1738 and dedicated himself to founding an orphanage there, the Bethesda Orphanage. And when his goal was threatened by financial woes, Whitefield campaigned in 1749 for the colony of Georgia to overturn its prior decision to outlaw slavery, believing that slave labor would make his orphanage and the plantations that would support it prosperous. Georgia made slavery legal again in 1751, after some decades of it being illegal. Did you know that? I did not. And I have relatives from Savannah, and I didn't know this. Whitefield's own plantation, called Providence Plantation, helped fund his beloved orphanage, where children were schooled in strict Calvinist teachings. Prayer and repentance were central to this. Slaves worked at the plantation and at the orphanage, making Whitefield's dreams into realities. And this man is remembered as one of the founders of Methodism. As an evangelical preacher, however, Whitefield would excel at drawing crowds, since his charismatic style elicited emotional responses from those who witnessed it. People flocked to see him preach, both in the English colonies and back home. Even Benjamin Franklin attended a revival meeting in Philadelphia and was impressed by the power of this preacher to capture the attention and passion of a huge crowd. Is it any wonder then that John Murray would be drawn to this man's congregation once he came back to England from Ireland? But things would take a turn for Murray. A Calvinistic Methodist minister named James Relly would come to a conclusion that shocked his colleagues and would end up provoking John Murray as it had others. Relly questioned the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination, the belief that some people are inherently good and thus destined for heaven, while others are simply inherently flawed, bad, and thus destined for hellfire. I'm not a theologian, forgive me if I seem to be oversimplifying this, but here in our own congregation at CUUC, our beloved friend Charlie Barcelow used to say that his grandmother explained it like this: some people are sheep, by which she meant beloved of Jesus, the lambs, and some are goats, that's the opposite. Sheep will go up to heaven, goats will go down, straight to hell. Well, James Relly was a preacher who came to question such teachings. If Christ died to redeem humankind, he reasoned, didn't he die to redeem all of humankind? In 1759, Relly put his ideas out for the world to see with the publication of A Union, a treatise of the consanguinity and affinity between Christ and his church. Well, Whitefield and the other evangelical Calvinists were so offended at Relly's questioning accepted doctrine that they cast him out of their circle, and he started his own church. Thus became the birth of modern Universalist thought, as Rellyites rallied around him. When John Murray, by now a passionate Calvinist preacher, learned that a good and pious member of Whitefield's flock had, well, obviously lost her mind and defected to become a Rellyiite, who was now clearly being deceived and ensnared and led straight to hell, something had to be done. So he gathered others and they paid this woman a call. The woman greeted them pleasantly, and then, when the talk turned to faith, she challenged their beliefs. If Jesus is not the Savior of unbelievers, is asking them to believe in him a lie? And if you once were a non-believer yourself, did he never die for you until you believed? She really gave them a running. How can you say his death saved all and then say, no, only some? Well, this was a significant moment for the Reverend John Murray. This woman swiftly had confounded his reasoning and embarrassed him into silence. So he left, vowing to avoid Universalists. But the things that Jezebel had said haunted him. Now, Jezebel is my term. It's not historical. I just like saying the word Jezebel and picturing Betty Davis in my mind. So I put it in here. John Murray decided to find some hard logic in the stance against universalism, and his search led him to read Relly's treatise and then reread it. And finally, he went to go hear James Relly preach, and at last, after his wife, who also saw the logic of that crazy Jezebel, he converted to Universalism himself. This did not endear John Murray to the people, friends, and family who had been his companions on his journey through life, as you can imagine. He had been corrupted himself. And then he faced devastating grief due to the loss of his young wife and their one-year-old son to illness, followed by the deaths of 3 sisters and a brother. I imagine his detractors must have seen these misfortunate events as acts of God, punishment for his defection. from Calvinist thought. And John Murray cracked under pressure. Deeply depressed, he considered suicide, but then he decided to leave everything behind him and boarded a ship bound for the colonies. It was now 1770. John Murray was on his way to New York. Whee! New York, New York. But destiny intervened. The ship ran aground off the shore of New Jersey. John Murray went ashore. Murray was to encounter there a local man who was extremely excited about meeting a Universalist minister. This man had built a meeting house and was immediately stricken by an unerring belief that Reverend John Murray had been sent by a benevolent God to preach there. Murray declined the invitation, swearing that he needed to get back on board the ship before the wind changed and it left for New York. But this man, one Thomas Potter, convinced Murray to preach in his building if Sunday came and no change of wind had occurred. So Sunday did come, and John Murray preached a sermon in that building that Thomas Potter swore had been built to welcome him to American shores. And later that day, the winds shifted, and Murray sailed to New York. But Mr. Potter's church had been christened, if you will, by a Universalist. Reverend John Murray would eventually settle in Gloucester, Massachusetts. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, it's because I'm a Florida native. Gloucester? Okay, whatever. He would become minister to the first Universalist church in our country, when it wasn't even our country yet. He would serve as a chaplain in the Revolutionary War and as minister of the Universalist Society of Boston later on. In 1786, the Gloucester Church won freedom from taxation in a ruling by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which created precedent and actually contributed to the ideological development of our young nation's embrace of the desire for separation of church and state, after a process of disentanglement reached its necessary end. You see, Massachusetts up to that time contained many villages or towns that typically had one central church, and local residents were required to pay taxes to support that church, whether they attended it or not. But since these crazy Universalists had set up their own alternative church, they decided not to pay the taxes that would be supporting the main central church in Gloucester, and it ended up being a particularly thorny issue for that church, which now faced a rivalry in the form of these scandalous Universalists and their heretical thinking. So it went to court. Thankfully. Also, the woman that Reverend John Murray married here in the colonies, Judith Sargent Murray, a Universalist and feminist who absolutely deserves her own bio, though we won't hear it today, was totally instrumental to his preaching. I think it's safe to say it never would have happened without her. Her father was a big supporter of John Murray and his ministry. Together, they spread the word about universal salvation, which would become known as Universalism. The Universalist denomination blossomed in the 1790s, and John Murray continued to preach into the new 19th century. Today, he is called the father of American Universalism. Thanks for coming on this little journey with me.
Thank you so much for that informative and, with Joe, always entertaining presentation. Next, we will hear about Walt Whitman from Dan Wolfe.
was asked to do this talk, the first name that popped in my head was Walt Whitman. As we're all aware, Walt Whitman was an iconic American poet, essayist, and journalist who's most often called the father of free verse. His revolutionary collection, Leaves of Grass, is a landmark in American literature celebrating democracy, individualism, the body, and the natural world. I've heard many times over that Walt Whitman was a member of the Unitarian Church. That's not true, much to my surprise. Whitman was born on Long Island, New York in 1819 and grew up in both rural and urban environments. His father was a farmer and carpenter, and his mother had a Quaker background. His formal education was limited, but he became a printer's apprentice and later worked extensively as a journalist and newspaper editor in New York and Brooklyn, and for a time worked as a school teacher. These early careers exposed him directly to the democratic life and diverse peoples of America, which would become central to his poetry. His first edition of Leaves of Grass was self-published in 1855, a slim volume of 12 untitled poems, including what would become Song of Myself. The book was largely ignored by the public, but famously praised by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Whitman spent the rest of his life revising and expanding the collection, creating 9 different editions. During the Civil War, he worked as a volunteer nurse in military hospitals in Washington, D.C., profoundly impacting his later works, notably the collection Drum Taps and the elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed. He held government clerkships in Washington and eventually settled in Camden, New Jersey in 1873, following a paralytic stroke. He died in 1892. As I said at the beginning, Walt Whitman was not formally a Unitarian. For that matter, he was not a member of any established church. However, his unique spirituality and poetic philosophy share significant common ground with liberal religious movements. He was a religious skeptic who believed in a vast, non-dogmatic spirituality. He was a great admirer of the transcendentalists, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, a former Unitarian minister himself, whose essay, The Poet, is widely credited with inspiring Whitman to write Leaves of Grass. Although he was not a formal Unitarian member, there are many shared values of Unitarianism and UU that Walt Whitman believed in. He believed in individual divinity. Like Unitarianism, Whitman's poetry emphasizes the inherent divinity and worth of every individual, which is UU's first principle. Divine am I, inside and out, he declared. He believed in the rejection of dogma. He was anti-clerical and rejected the need for traditional priests or churches to mediate the individual's relationship with the divine. He stated that everyone should be their own priest. This is in line with UU's third principle, the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, and UU's fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. He believed in the immanence of God. His belief in finding the divine in nature and the material world, and in the present moment, aligns closely with the seventh UU principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. He believed in progressive optimism. Whitman's optimistic view of democracy, human progress, and the evolution toward perfection resonates with the liberal theology of the Unitarians and Universalists, and aligns with the second UU principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and also the fifth UU principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and society at large. In short, while Whitman had his own highly personal, all-encompassing religion, a new religion suitable for the modern democracy, his philosophical and spiritual foundation was deeply influenced by the same currents of thought that gave rise to American Unitarianism. And although never a member of a Unitarian church, he should have been.
This morning we honor the legacy of James Luther Adams, one of the great architects of modern Unitarian Universalism. He was a Unitarian parish minister, social activist, journal editor, distinguished scholar, translator, and editor of major German theologians, prolific author, and divinity school professor for more than 40 years. Adams shaped the minds of hundreds of students in preparation for the liberal ministry, and also other scholarly professions as well. He was the most influential theologian among American Unitarian Universalists of the 20th century, and one of the finest 20th century American liberal theologians generally. He was born in 1901 in Washington. His parents were Christian fundamentalists. So a recurring theme of both church and home is the concept of Judgment Day. So that they needed to find divine salvation before that day came. He was off to the University of Minnesota, and where he was, in his own words, on the rebound from fundamentalism. He railed against organized religion and briefly embraced atheistic humanism. Eventually, however, he began to attend meetings, the Saturday Men's Club at the local UU church, and soon listening to the Unitarian preachings of Reverend John Dietrich, a leading proponent of another type of humanism, at once scientific and religious. One of his professors, Frank Rehrig, who was a Unitarian, saw within him, in all his railings against religion, saw within him a passionate impulse for religion. And in a career counseling session, Rehrig told Adams, much to his consternation, "You will be a minister." And as it were, he astonished his friends that the raving humanist that he was set off for Harvard Divinity School. What really shaped James Luther Adams was his trips to Germany. In his words, in the summer of 1927, 6 years after Hitler became head of the movement, and 6 years before the party came to power, I visited Nuremberg just at the time when thousands of people, young and old, were in the city for the annual Nazi festival. On the day of the Great Parade, in the streets of Nuremberg, history, as it was being made at that juncture, gave me personally a traumatic jolt. Standing in the jostling crowds and watching the thousands of singing Nazis with their innumerable brass bands as they passed along the street, I inadvertently got into a conversation with some people who turned out to be Nazi sympathizers. Out of curiosity, as to what they would say. I asked a bystander the meaning of the swastika that was everywhere evident. Within a few minutes, I found myself in a heated conversation with more and more people, and particularly when the discussion turned to the Jewish question. As I bore down an argument against these defenders of Nazism, asking more and more insistent questions, I was suddenly seized by the elbows from behind and pulled vehemently out of the crowd. No one made an effort to help me. I immediately thought I was being taken into custody. I could not see who, after extricating me from the crowd, marched me vigorously down a side street, then turned up into an alley. Upon reaching the dead end of the alley, my host, a young German workingman in his 30s, wheeled me around and shouted at me, "Don't you know that when you watch a parade in Germany today, you either keep your mouth shut or get your head bashed in?" My palpitation mounted even higher at this moment, and I was all the more puzzled when my captor smiled and said, "Don't be frightened. I have saved you." Saved me from what? From being sandbagged. In about 5 minutes, more of that argument on the curb, they would have knocked you out, flat on the pavement. He returned again to Germany in 1936. He recounts his meeting with the German psychiatrist and philosopher Karl Jaspers at his home in Heidelberg. I asked him what he deemed to be the contemporary influence of liberal Christianity. He replied with unwanted vehemence, "Religious liberalism has no significance. It has Zwang," German word meaning commitment, in this context, no costing commitment. If fascism should arise in the States, what in your past performance would constitute a pattern or framework of resistance? I could only give a feeble answer to the question. My principal political activities have been the readings of newspapers and voting. I had preached sermons on the Depression or in defense of strikers. Occasionally, I uttered protests against censorship in Boston, but I had no adequate conception of citizenship participation. He returned again in 1938. Gestapo arrested him. Gestapo arrested him and charged him with walking on the street with a deposed Jewish teacher and attending the synagogue. After hours of what he described as bludgeoning questioning, he was released. He said, "It is difficult, I say, to suppress giving an account of incidents in connection with the Nazis, the anti-Nazis, and the hidden underlings. It is even more difficult to determine how to compress into a brief statement what all this did for the evolution of my social concern." He had a 40-year career, serving in several divinity schools, one of which was Harvard, which he served from 1956 until 1968. He was always open. He and his wife, Margaret, we met at his first parish ministry up in Salem, Massachusetts. Had an open house one evening a week. We're going to invite all the students in. But what's the legacy? The legacy of James Luther Adams can be summed up in this. The Reverend Martin Wolf talks in divinity schools graduate, they're given a plastic bag. They become known as the 5 smooth stones of modern religious liberalism. That is a nod to in the Hebrew Bible, the biblical story of David and Goliath, where David goes down into the stream and picks up 5 smooth stones. And facing the giant with just him, his 5 stones and a slingshot, slays the mighty giant. We don't take it quite so. We take a little more non-violent approach to the 5 smooth stones. According to Adams, the 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism is: religious liberalism depends on the principle that revelation is continuous. Our religious tradition is a living tradition because we are always learning new truths. Two, all relations between persons ought ideally to rest on mutual free consent and not on coercion. We freely choose to enter into relationship with one another. Number 3, religious liberalism affirms the moral obligation to direct one's effort toward the establishment of a just and loving community. It is this which makes the role of the prophet central and indispensable in liberalism. Justice. We deny the immaculate conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation, agency. Good things don't just happen. People make them happen. And finally, liberalism holds that the resources, divine and human, that are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. So here's for hope, and thank you.
And now we will hear about Reverend James Reed from Mike McGraw.
Good morning. Good morning. You men of note. James Reed. Spelling is R-E-E-B, and I definitely implore you to go into some more in-depth research into this gentleman and his family. James Reed, excuse me. Not a name that comes to mind as someone who made the ultimate sacrifice of his life for his faith, but here as a Unitarian Universalist minister, he did just that. His path through this UU ministry was not as straightforward as it would seem. Growing up in Casper, Wyoming, of all places, as a devout conservative Christian, he attended and graduated from the Princeton Theological Seminary and then went to work as a Presbyterian chaplain. In 1957, he resigned his chaplaincy and initiated his conversion to become a fully ordained Unitarian Universalist minister, which did occur finally in 1962. As part of the seminary school, if you decide to change your faith allegiance, You can do that, but it takes a 5-year period of like a transition. And there's some hoops to go through. The mid to late 60s were tumultuous and strange times here in America, as those of us who lived through those years can attest. Central to the political and social unrest in this country was suffering, were the actions and demands for civil rights that had, and still are, denying these rights to Black, brown, indigenous, and poor Americans for decades, despite our founder statements along the lines of, quote, all men are created equal. Moving to Boston, the Reeves joined the Arlington Street Unitarian Universalist Church. While there, he maintained his association in the UUA Department of Ministry, leading him to join the UUA Commission on Religion and Race in January of 1965. On Monday, March 8, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. sent out calls to all peoples of faith to join him on their second planned march to Montgomery, Alabama, from Selma, in approaching the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The first attempt at crossing that bridge was thwarted. So Martin Luther King sent out his calls to people to join him on their second planned march. James thought long and hard about leaving his wife and 4 children. He decided to go and help, as it was crucial for people of faith to bear witness. On March 9th, he was in his second attempt march to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but was again turned back by the assaults of police on the marchers. He and 2 other Unitarian Universalist colleagues, Orloff Miller and Clark Olson, went to a dinner that evening at a diner in a racially mixed neighborhood. Leaving the diner and walking back to the church that was to have Martin Luther King Jr. give a speech, the trio took a wrong turn and ended up walking into a white neighborhood coming from a Black and racially mixed neighborhood. While walking, a group of about 4 to 5 white men called out to them and began to harass these 3 ministers. They then attacked the ministers, punching and kicking viciously, as one of the attackers with a club swung his club, striking James along the side of his head. James was the most seriously injured minister from this attack. Getting James to an ambulance was a nightmare endeavor that finally got him to a hospital in Birmingham. The hospital neurosurgeon who was assigned to the hospital was there, and under the care, and giving the care, I should say, James was admitted there and was rushed immediately into surgery. He ended up in a coma for a brief time, but then passed away. On March 11th, 1965, 2 days after arriving in Selma, Alabama, he was dead. The then President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, sent the Voting Rights Act to Congress within days. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was invited by the administration to Washington, D.C. to support the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Dr. King declined in order to deliver the eulogy at Reeves' funeral. So one takeaway excuse me, is not only to replace caution with courage, and to not only be concerned with the murderers, but also to be highly concerned with this political and economic landscape that still burns to this day, with its systemic racist philosophy, if I dare to label it other than its vileness, to work for the acceptance of living and learning ways to live a life in faith of our complete integration with love, empathy, compassion, and curiosity, as which are hallmark endeavors of a Unitarian Universalist.